Hey, it's Stephanie,
And Christy.
and welcome back to another parent teacher conference where we believe that conversations about our kids shouldn't just happen once or twice a year. It should be an ongoing dialogue.
Okay, so if you are a parent to a boy, a classroom teacher, a coach, or if you have a boy or a young man in your life that you care about, this episode is for you. Today, we are going to be taking a deep dive into raising boys and how complicated yet rewarding that responsibility can be in today's digital world.
So, culturally, we are at a point in time where the spotlight is on boys, and the ensuing discourse about them is somewhat alarmist, especially when it comes to the influences shaping their world. Whether you are well versed on the manosphere or you're still trying to figure out how to spell looks maxing, we are here to discuss the headlines, dive into the research, and provide the necessary wisdom to support parents in navigating the highs and lows of raising young men.
Stephanie grew up with five brothers, and we are both mothers to two young boys. And we have spent the better parts of our careers working with boys. For the purposes of this conversation, however, we wanted to bring in some additional expertise, and I could think of no one more suited to support our discussion than Jonathan Reed. Jonathan is the Director of Impact at Next Gen Men, a small but mighty nonprofit working towards a future where boys and men feel less pain and cause less harm. They offer youth outreach and workshops, education for parents, educators, and coaches. What makes them unique is that their experience is rooted not only in a robust academic understanding of boys, but also in the lived experience of working with them in schools, in community spaces like camps, clubs, and teams. Personally, I've had the privilege of working with Jonathan on a number of initiatives over the years. I've taken workshops of his that have had enduring applications to my own practice. Jonathan, I know you are so passionate about the work that you do, and we are so pleased to have you on the pod today.
Thanks for having me.
So, before we get started, is there anything you want our audience to know about you personally or the values of your work?
I'll just say I've been working with Next Gen Men for 8 years. As you will be able to tell in the span of this conversation, I'm incredibly passionate about our work. And what I usually highlight about Next Gen Men's approach is that we have three different sort of anchors to how we do the work that we do with boys and young men. The first being finding effective entry points. So not just saying, whoa, let's now talk about mental health, but like really meeting them where they are and walking together towards less familiar topics or conversations. The second is a strengths-based approach. So recognizing the inherent capability and desire to be healthy towards themselves, to be good towards other people, and to build on their strengths rather than see them as problems that need to be fixed. And the third is a relational approach, that within everything that we do is a relationship, and that's the medium through which, all positive growth and transformation takes place. I mean, I could ramble on and on about the background, but I know we've got some really interesting things to talk about, so I'll leave it at that.
It's such a powerful and I think a full scope mission that really resonates with the work that you guys do, Jonathan. So, to frame our discussion today, I wanted to just give some context again from our lens and our experience as women working with boys and mothers to young sons for what we see as the landscape in raising boys today, and then get into some of the specifics of your work and your expertise, Jonathan. So, there has and continues to be this persistent and enduring societal rhetoric around boyhood and the transition to becoming a man that is so often characterized by ideas around toughening up, physical strength, financial stability, elite financial status, the notion of holding back tears at a young age, and very commonly expression of anger as the one socially acceptable emotion when we know that beneath the surface there might be a whole host or spectrum of things that boys are actually feeling. What this reality often means for boys is that they're left vulnerable in how they deal with shame, with loneliness, and uncomfortable feelings. They don't often have the vocabulary to express what it is that they're feeling. It means that they are often underrepresented in statistics that capture abuse, assault, sexual violence, and other types of harms, not because they don't experience them, but because the stakes of reporting are so high for them. And it also means that ultimately they are at a much greater risk of suicide because of the inability to articulate and ask for help. So men are more likely to be both victims and perpetrators of violence. A major risk factor for perpetuating the cycle is experiencing neglect and abuse as a child or being exposed to violence at a very young age. So lots there in terms of the landscape that we're facing when it comes to this question or this responsibility of raising boys. And these were universal truths, I would say, well before boys were being psychologically inundated with social media. Jonathan, how has the landscape of digital citizenry impacted the reality of what it means to be a boy today?
We're just like starting with like the biggest questions that you could possibly. I'm just kidding. So, no, I have like so much to say about that. And number one, it's worth saying. So, I'll say this off the hop, so I don't feel the need to keep saying. But like talking about the vulnerability of boys is not an erasure of the way that girls and women and people of other genders are impacted by violence that is most often perpetrated by men. So, just to say that, yeah, again, like an anchor of the work that Next Gen Men does is recognizing that if boys' well-being can be a priority, if they feel safe and well, they can orient themselves towards the well-being of others, right? So that this isn't like a zero-sum game where we're like marching up this hill of like men's rights activism, but saying that like, yeah, let's think about boys' well-being, and in doing so, we're going to make a better world for everybody. In terms of, yeah, the question about the digital landscape, I would say that like a lot of this stuff is being brought to the extreme, and polarization is happening in really significant ways as well. So like I know boys who've completely have set themselves in response to this like manosphere, man up content. They're like, that is not me. I'm orienting myself towards health and well-being and connection and emotional expression. And they are at one far end of that continuum. And then there's obviously boys and young men who are deep in those spaces, and they might be, embedded in like fitness content or, dating relationship, the incel stuff that we might talk about in this conversation. And they're in this far end of, the red pill or the black pill, like vitriol often against girls and women, but that also translates to other sort of extreme ways of thinking about people who are different from them. And that's at the other end of this extreme. So I'm seeing this polarization happening because of how the digital landscape is impacting the way that we think about ourselves and about each other. And then with masculinity stuff in particular, again, like listeners have probably heard of the manosphere and might be thinking of shows like Adolescence or the Louis Theroux documentary. Those are relevant, but they're kind of representative of like an earlier version of the manosphere. And in the last couple of years, it's become increasingly mainstream and also increasingly fragmented. And so there's these spaces that are representing for boys what fitness is supposed to look like or what financial success is supposed to look like. And that's all wrapped up in the long enduring norms and expectations for what masculinity is supposed to be. But boys get like, kind of like you said, like inundated with those messages. Even when they're not looking for them, the algorithms have identified this is a young man. And this happens to me, for example. Instagram is very convinced that I want to base jump off a cliff and that I really want to start a workout routine. And that's based a little bit on my demographic and what Meta thinks of me. So I'll pause there, but I would say two big pieces are the polarization and then the extreme that like masculinity identities are being brought to.
I just wanted to start off by saying that I love how you grounded your work in the idea that it's not an erasure of women's experiences, that you're really about seeking to look at the root cause of the experiences of men. It sounds like you look at behaviors or maybe perhaps emotions as a symptom of a deeper need that boys are trying to meet. And I think that is such a gentle way of bringing boys to like their true selves, helping them find a place or space where they feel like they can express things. And I also really appreciate the way you talked about the extremes and polarization that can come from social media. And it sounds like you're saying that, boys are inundated and it's hard to escape things, even when, even if someone is not looking for it. And that makes boys particularly vulnerable.
Totally. You will also be able to tell. I love telling stories, and this is just how I propel my work, is thinking about the real boys and young men that I'm lucky to have in my life. And so just as an example, there's a kid that I know who's 13 now, and this is when he was 12. And he messaged me and he couldn't sleep. And the situation was he liked a girl and the girl didn't like him back. Kind of a tale as old as time. We've all experienced that. And what he really wanted to talk about with me was what's wrong with me. That's what he wanted to know. And I kind of ended up feeling like I was like probably sounding like his mom, because I was like, I don't know what to tell you. I think you're great. I think you're thoughtful and charismatic and funny and awesome to spend time around. And he legitimately wrote to me, don't bullshit me. And usually when I'm talking with a young person, we're kind of aligned and we're talking in the same space, but I really felt this sense of misalignment with where he was at and thinking about himself and where I was at and thinking about him. And I thought about it afterwards and really just found myself being like, he's operating from this very deep certainty that there's something wrong with him. And where could that possibly come from? And I found myself thinking about the online spaces that he's being shipped content that constantly says, you as a young man are not enough. You are not charismatic enough or confident enough. You don't make enough money. You don't get enough girls. Like your body is not muscular enough. Like it's just like a constant drum that's probably being beaten in his in his context. And then like a few days later, he turned 13 years old, and he said he spent the first hour of his 13th birthday, so this is like midnight to 1 a.m. crying to himself. And that's how alone and self-conscious, that he felt. And so for me, the signals are like, this is about his well-being. Like if he feels that inadequate, like of course that impacts his mental health and well-being. It's also relevant to the way of relating to girls, right? If he bases his entire sense of worth on whether or not a girl likes him, that becomes really hard to take no for an answer, right? Because all of a sudden that no isn't just a rejection of like that possibility of relationship, but a rejection of you and your status as a man. So that's, for me, that's like a memory of this interplay between boys' well-being and the potential for violence against others. And it's also just a demonstration of, how powerful that online rhetoric can be because of how consistently or regularly, it's showing up in boys' lives and their algorithmic feeds.
Jonathan, I want to just echo or sort of reiterate for parents listening some of the key takeaways from that story, I think, in that message in the work that you do and the work that we've done with boys too, is the importance of disrupting the narrative that they are being inundated with from online culture and doing so in a way that is person to person, right? I think what I've overwhelmingly learned working with boys is that they want to connect, but they are so often told that they're not supposed to. They're not supposed to have that need. They're not supposed to want to. They're supposed to figure it out themselves. And the establishment of a safe space or a safe person to be able to express those questions is essential. And I think sometimes the rhetoric that we're seeing in the manosphere, in these kind of, as you've mentioned, fragmented subgroups and spaces that are being echoed really loudly online, can intimidate a lot of people, especially women, from engaging with boys in that way. Because there is this underlying assumption that boys are bad, boys are threatening. This is how boys view me. Therefore, I can't be that vulnerable resource for them. And I think deconstructing what's underneath that noise is the vulnerability that you're talking about.
Yeah, when I think about how to navigate conversations about those voices online, and this is like, I'm sure this is like a constant refrain in a parenting podcast, but like the go-to is curiosity. And one time I was driving with a kid and his dad. He was in grade 9. This is rewinding all the way back to like the centrality of Andrew Tate, and his dad had heard about Andrew Tate, and his dad climbed right up on a soapbox, and I could kind of tell, I don't actually think this kid is that big of a fan of Andrew Tate. If anybody, by the way, hasn't heard of Andrew Tate, he's faded in his prominence, but he was the central figure of manosphere content. He was more Googled than Donald Trump, Kim Kardashian, and the Queen all put together. Like, he just this meteoric rise in virality back in like 2021 or 2022. Anyways, at the time it was relevant, and at the time I was like, I don't think this kid actually is that into Andrew Tate, but I think he's kind of messing with his dad. But his dad wasn't curious. His dad had a message to tell him about what was okay and what was not, and what was an acceptable, mindset or narrative and what wasn't. And the thing that's interesting about these online influencers is, okay, well, I'll just say there's another influencer named Myron Gaines, and he was actually featured in the Louis Theroux documentary. So he's still relevant. He only appeals to a very specific sort of subset of young men, but he runs a podcast called Fresh and Fit. And there's a clip in his YouTube channel that essentially was like, I can't remember if it was your parents, your teacher, your social worker, whatever, but it was like the adults in your life will tell you that I'm toxic. And they're doing that because they want to tear you down. They want to hold you back. And so they're going to cancel me, basically. And he was doing this like very classic sort of like victim, like is this victim narrative, right? But the interesting thing is if you as a teacher or a parent climb up on that soapbox and you're like, yeah, that guy is toxic. We've got to cancel that guy. All of a sudden you proved him right. And all of a sudden everything else that he has to say might actually have a kernel of truth in it because that one thing that he said did. And he's got like really problematic stuff to say about misogyny, misogynistic views on girls and women in particular. But he also has another clip about finances and having a good credit score, right? So I think what's relevant is that a lot of these influencers have both negative content and positive content. And if we try to just write them off as completely toxic, or if boys try to view them as complete idols, we miss that nuance. And it's a lot more effective. And I do this all the time with boys to actually watch clips with them and to unpack with them what's good in what they have to say, what's potentially harmful in what they have to say, and really interestingly, what are some of the worldview assumptions that they've made about how the world works or what manhood is all about. You know, at one point, again, this is not that relevant anymore, but Jordan Peterson said the opposite of weak is dangerous. And I was like, I don't know if that's true. Like, I could think of other opposites to weak, you know, if I was, but the interesting thing is having that conversation with curiosity and not judgment allows you to kind of unpack what's landing, what's not, where do boys draw the line, where don't they, what have they, you know, assumed without challenging, you know, and so on, and to be able to walk alongside them through that manosphere or that, you know, digital masculinity landscape rather than just shut them out.
Thank you. As you were talking, it reminded me of what you said in the beginning of one of your foundational pillars, which
Mhm.
is entry points. And the way that you describe that illustrates what it means to get on their level and discuss and engage in a meaningful way. And ultimately disrupt their thinking. As Christy was talking about, the most important thing that we need to do is disrupt the thinking. And again, the way that you do that is with such tenderness. Like, we're
Mhm.
not going to help boys without that because, or we're not going to teach them tenderness without demonstrating it ourselves first. So thank you for doing that. I also wanted to go back to the story that you were sharing about the young man who said, or you described him as coming from a place of deep certainty that he is not enough.
Mm.
And that phrase just kind of lingered with me a little bit more. And I wanted to ask you, would you say that is what the major concern your work seeks to address? Is that what you're here to do at the end of the day? Help young men realize that they are enough? Or is there a different way that you would go about describing that?
Yeah, what a beautiful question. You are enough. Like, that's a powerful thing to hear. And a similar phrase that's like, I can't remember which researcher this was, but this is going back probably to like the 90s or something like that, that he asked a bunch of, maybe not that long ago, but he asked a bunch of high schoolers, what would you tell your younger self? And the answer was be yourself. And so you are enough, be yourself. Like, I love those. I would add that as an organization and also as a mentor or facilitator, that it's not just enough to tell boys, be yourself, because boys also want to become men. Not every single boy. Like, there's other boys who are like very content with the idea of just being themselves, and they're gonna like ride unicorns and like, you know, and perform in musicals and whatever it might be. But there's a group of boys and young men for whom manhood and the question and the identity of manhood is really relevant. And so just telling them you're enough just as you are, for me, is missing just one little bit of a step, which is asking them and exploring with them, what does manhood mean to you? And you know, and in doing so, some parts of that might be stereotypical, you know, and some parts of that might be totally brand new and emerging. So what I would hope for is that boys who are able to say, I want to be strong and I want to be gentle, you know, or I want to be protective and I want to be confident, you know, and I want to be sensitive. Like, that all these different elements of humanity can become represented in how they think of themselves as boys who are growing into young men. So I do that a lot with conversations, is explore with boys what qualities actually matter to you. And once they've identified those qualities and they can find ways to think about those qualities and especially put those qualities into practice, that will start to not just tell them you are enough, but it'll start to for them to feel like they are deep inside themselves, because they're actually acting in a way that aligns with the most true version of who they want to be.
I'm hearing, Jonathan, and I want to put a big plug in for this, ask as opposed to being told.
Mm,
So ask them that beautiful question, what does manhood mean to you? As opposed to telling them what it's supposed to be. And I think in doing this work, one of the things that people sometimes fall victim to is having a really polarizing dialogue with young people about, and I think you were talking about this with Gaines and with some of these influencers, right versus wrong. I know in
mhm.
some of the work that we've done, that entry point and interpretation can sometimes be, well, you're writing off this person that I look to for workout advice. So therefore you're saying fitness is bad and therefore you have nothing to offer me in this conversation. And so I think being able to have a more general discussion based on what they think and what they feel and why is important as a starting point. And one of the things that I've really taken away from a workshop that you hosted that I attended on boys as relational learners. And
Mhm.
so really the concept there is that their emotional connection to a teacher, a coach, or facilitator has a lot to do with their buy-in, their performance and success, that boys are overwhelmingly relational learners. So in working with youth, when you have these discussions around role models, who are the most negative figures that come up and who are the positive ones? And how do you approach conversations about problematic role models? Because I know one of the things that you talked about was we need to direct boys more so to some of the positive influences that are out there that might be lesser known.
Yeah. Yeah, I get this question a lot. Like I feel like a lot of people know the guys who like the let's just put in quotations like negative influencers who like crash through the media headlines. So like Andrew Tate was a big one. Clavicular was probably the more recent one. So guys that are representing again a really rigid set of norms about masculinity who are often doing it in like a harmful or an exploitative way. Rather than just like assume I know everything, like I constantly ask boys. And so like my list also includes like TJR, who's a fitness influencer, Ashton Hall, who's like kind of perplexing, but is also like some sort of like workout, but also finance influencer. There's Sneeko, who's into gaming. Jim Skin, who's into gym. The list kind of goes on and on, but there's all these different guys, and that's part of the fragmentation of the manosphere that I kind of mentioned earlier. But they're still like relatively easy to like list and think about because they've got such strong brand identities that they kind of like come to mind like really easily. Whereas healthy influences in boys' lives, not to say that like some elements of those guys' presence aren't unhealthy. I'm kind of just generalizing and being relatively extreme with it, but like other healthy influences in boys' lives, I think are more nuanced, are more balanced, are less viral, right? And so they don't immediately spring to mind. Like I've had this conversation with adults and they're like, um, Barack Obama? Like, we have no idea really. So I have two kind of answers to that. One is I'm working right now on an initiative that's called the Young Men in Media Collective. And what we're trying to do is basically create content that doesn't challenge or combat the narrative that means that is to be a man is to be relentlessly rich and ripped. Like we're actually not trying to challenge or combat that. We're trying to present an alternative to it in ways that are familiar and relevant and engaging for boys and young men. And so my specific piece of the project, or my team's specific piece of the project, is we're going to work with streamers in competitive video gaming spaces. So, which are obviously often hyper competitive, like derogatory meme culture. And to represent a more grounded, still fun and engaging and charismatic, but also balanced approach to masculinity in gaming. The point being, we are creating those influences like right here and now, basically. And we're going to be exploring what works and what doesn't, and then hopefully continuing to do that in the years to come. And the other is just the real people in boys' lives. And you've probably heard me say this, Christy, where, I'm on the radio or something like that. And I'm like, if you're listening to this, you have a boy in your life, whether he's your son in your family, in your classroom, on your street, in your neighborhood, that sports team, like whoever it might be. Like it's your duty to reach out to him and to spend time with him and show an interest in him. And because what I heard way back when Andrew Tate was rising in popularity, like I had some boys that were like, Andrew Tate's irrelevant to me because I would talk to you about that, right? The point being, I've got an active mentor in my life who actually cares about me, right? And has helped me and been with me and has already demonstrated, right, everything that Andrew Tate is supposing, that like, oh, I care about you and I want to see you succeed. Like they're like, if I actually have a mentor in my life, like I'm not going to be as buffeted by those more viral influencers online. So the two, yeah. So again, so the two are like, we're trying to build those influencers kind of from the ground up, but I also would never like underestimate the impact of a real coach, or a teacher or a family friend to do that work as well.
I know that you've kind of answered this question, but I'm just going to ask it anyways. So, can you share a story with us that best illustrates the burdens that young men carry, but also the power that mentorship can have when somebody is feeling down and out?
Yeah. I mean, I have like 1,000, but hey, parents listening to this, basically Next Gen Men's origin was school-based programming. And in the midst of the pandemic, schools closed and we started a Discord server, which is an online social media platform. And we have for 6 years now been stewarding, a healthy and supportive peer community for middle school and high school boys that's mostly centered around gaming. So if you have a son in middle school or high school, he might be interested. Fortnite, Valorant, Minecraft, Roblox, all that kind of thing. It's at nextgenmen.ca/alliance. And so the story is we have like an ask anything sort of anonymous question support sort of forum. And we got a question from a 13-year-old who his question was, does anybody have any ideas on how I can lose weight? And there's a lot to say about body image and fitness influencers, online environments. And my first sort of thought in how, because we always respond to these. And so my first thought of how to respond to it was like, you probably won't be surprised to know that I was thinking about like self-love and self-acceptance. And that, well, I have like a meme that I post every now and then that basically says like, you can't hate yourself into a version that you'll love.
Mm.
And so that was where my mind went first. But I sat with it and I thought about, again, this like commitment that we have to really meeting young people where they are. Where he was at was he wanted specific advice. He didn't want to be told, oh, love yourself. It'll all be fine. But he really wanted like actual tactical advice. And so I did some research and ended up doing 3 different things. Number one was providing him with some education on what's actually going on in his body at that time in his life. I didn't really know this, but and I might be getting some of this slightly wrong, but essentially, because this is a while ago, but essentially, like boys at the start of puberty, essentially are gaining weight and are supposed to be gaining weight like more than any other stage of life apart from basically being an infant. That it's actually really important that you're gaining weight at age 12, 13 because of what your body is about to undergo. And so there was some education on like what's actually normal, and what part of what's going on there is like potentially this 13-year-old is comparing himself to like 25-year-olds whose bodies are completely different, partly because they are like peak testosterone, young adulthood. Like that's a completely different stage of physiological development. So there's a little bit of education. But then I went and looked for like what advice could I actually give? But I found out, for example, the dieting does not work. Like it really doesn't work. But sleep is actually a really important way. And again, teenagers like actually need more sleep than like any other age group. But sleep is actually relevant to how your body handles nutrition, weight loss, and weight gain. And there were a few other really relevant pieces about like what you can actually do to feel more healthy in your body. And then I concluded it with that self-love and self-acceptance and just being patient with yourself. The other thing that happened at the same time was like I, as the adult, took some time, and the facilitator of that space took some time to research and write that sort of methodological response. And at the same time, he got responses from boys who were 4 years older than him, 16, 17-year-old boys who were saying, I've been there. I know how I looked and how I felt when I was in grade 8. Be patient with yourself. It's gonna like things are gonna change. And we're really giving him advice that was so close to where he was. And so my role as a mentor kind of did 2 things at once. I was giving him this advice and research informed like knowledge about like how to take care of yourself at that age, but then I was also like building space for other peers to give him again advice that felt really relevant to where he was at. So again, I could tell story after story after story, but that for me was one that is special because that's not really a question you can really easily ask your mom, right?
Yeah.
Or bring up in class. And but to have a space and to have a relationship where you can kind of be honest about how you're feeling and try to get advice for something that you wouldn't normally talk about is not only special, but like really important for a boy's development. Stephanie, you look like you're about to say something.
Well, no, truthfully, as you were telling the story, I was going to cry because
Right.
all I kept thinking about is if that was my son, how lucky would he be to have someone like you and your organization be there for him? Like my heart just was like, this poor boy, thank you to you and
Mm.
to what you're doing because that care, because there's going to be a time in my life where my young boys are not going to need me. Right now, I have a 5 month old and a 3 year old, and I can just scoop them up in my arms when they need something, and I can tell them they're beautiful and they'll believe me. But there's going to be a time when then it's out of my control, it's out of my hands. And I see my work as a mother and your work in your organization as a partnership. Like a mother can't do it all. It takes a village. And it's so wonderful to hear about the role that you play in this village and what that means. And I'm sure the mother and the family of that boy that you provided support for, will feel the ripple effect of the
Hmm.
work that you're doing. So that's all I was gonna say. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I really do appreciate that. A lot of it is love and generosity and is like output, but it's worth acknowledging as well that the gift of working with young people, whether you're a parent, or an educator or, or something else, is you also are impacted and changed, and what a gift that is as well. So like for me, I also have gratitude for him, right? For having brought that up and done a lot, right? Like the demonstration of vulnerability, but also like giving me the opportunity to think differently about my own body, in a way. So it's nice to be appreciated, but it's also like my own privilege to, yeah, to be able to grow and change based on those kinds of interactions as well.
I think that's just, first of all, such a touching story to hear about the way in which you were able to read him for where he was at,
Uh-huh.
respond according to what you thought his needs were, and then probably open his mind up to a whole category of considerations he probably wasn't even thinking about looking to, like a quick fix, right? Like the internet would have suggested. So
Uh-huh.
I think you furthered your own connection with him. He was able to also build a bond with other young men in the group, right? And kind of look to that resource as opposed to what the algorithm might be telling him he should be doing with his body. I think that's a really great segue, Jonathan, into discussing in a little bit more depth how boys and young men are negotiating the online world. I was excited today for us to kind of be able to have a bit of a back and forth, knowing that I'm really coming from the advocacy space. And I think particularly with schools in mind about scaling back this access that young people have to social media, to devices, in the school context specifically, but looking at some of the larger harms. And I know you and I have had some brief discussions about how you're looking to the need that they have. And I think there's this reality that we have to confront, that they're on there, they want to be on there. They're not going to get off of there because the adults in their life are saying this has actually become a really dangerous space. So what I do like about the work that you're doing is if they're going to be on there anyways, as I understand it, the purpose and the function of this Discord space is to have adults moderating and kind of guiding a space that they're going to choose to exist in anyways. And the caveat on top of that is I had heard a mother share in the advocacy space recently that when we hand children or young people a smartphone most often, unlike anything else that we give them, there's no real coaching or front loading of use. It's here you go, figure it out, communicate and interpret that as you will. There should be more structure around how you message a friend, what conduct in group chat situations should like those boundaries just about how we communicate exist in every other facet of our social interaction except in online spaces, right? It really is trial by fire. And so the idea, I can really get on board with the idea of adults moderating a space that they're choosing to be in anyways.
Yeah, that is like a really I love the comparison of, if you think about it, the reason we have regulations about substance use or about driving is because the potential for harm is so high, right? So you're not allowed to actually do that until you've gotten some training on it, because you could really hurt somebody. And the amount of what's possible in a smartphone is, for sure, the potential for harm is really high. But you're very right, and I think a lot of adults just figure we don't actually know how to do that stuff any better than they do, because they're a young person, digital native, and they've got it all figured out. And then you're right, they totally have to navigate that individually. The metaphor that I often use is a sidewalk, basically. In that I've talked with I guess a couple of parents, but more often like school administrators or actually law enforcement, that are like, we need to ban social media and like get young people off these internet spaces because they're unsafe. And my answer to that is, of course they're unsafe. They're on the internet, and the internet is not safe. And you know what else is unsafe is sidewalks, because the sidewalks are on the street. A street is not safe. But our response to that is, number one, not like, good luck, have fun on the sidewalk, 5-year-old. and is also not like, you must never ever walk on a sidewalk. But we walk alongside them and we hold their hands, right? And we teach them to look both ways before they cross the street and to stop at stop signs until that all becomes muscle memory. And so I think we need to be doing like similar work in walking alongside young people as they foray into the digital landscape.
That's one of the blind spots, I think, of it, an age threshold, right? Is that what happens at 16? All of
Right.
a sudden, the brain is mature enough and developed enough to be able to thrown into that environment and navigate it effectively. It might be better adept at navigating some of those harms, but it's still going to be exposed to them. The youth are still going to fall victim. So it's complex for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been paying attention to what's happening in Canada with regard to, this like very topical conversation on young people in social media. But essentially, where things are at right now is, and I think this is interesting for anybody listening, is to know that currently Canada's talking about a social media ban for kids under 16 and an exemption for platforms that can prove to an independent regulator that they have basically like integrated safety by design for the young people on their platform. And I really think that our mainstream platforms, whether it's Meta, TikTok, Snap, Discord, like they are going to be motivated enough to retain access to that young demographic. Of course they are. That's called profit, for better or for worse, but they're going to be motivated enough to really take that commitment towards safety more seriously than they have before. And Discord, for example, I'm really passionate about Discord because of the work that I do, but they have like a family and parent caregivers hub. They have a well-being hub. They have a new thing called the Player's Guide. Like they're developing all these tools and sort of resources for young people and also for parents and guardians to help keep those young people safe. And so I think that middle ground, that balance between a ban and access is this like push towards safety for young people. The reality being like that's gonna make 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds safer. That's going to make everybody on the internet safer. Obviously, there's lots of consideration still about privacy and identity and, what are the standards of this regulatory body? Like there's lots still that's not answered. But but I think we're seeing from like other places in the world that like an outright ban, like a prohibition, I think we know if we look at history, like is not actually effective. And we need to be a little bit more nuanced and like less blunt instruments with the work that we do in trying to build safety into the digital context of young people.
The education piece alongside any measure of restriction is an essential ingredient. You cannot have any type of restriction without, as you've mentioned, the education leading up to and alongside of that, right? And I think that is where I've said this before, there's significant gaps there in terms of legitimizing that experience for students everywhere, right? As opposed to schools that have the priority or the resource available to invest in this type of programming, right? It should be a
Mm-hmm.
given right and a need of every student in school.
Yeah, I was on a call with some folks at Discord yesterday, and something I was pointing out is that Discord and a lot of other platforms have the ability to push information. And I know on Discord they do that because they get paid sponsorships basically from other brands to then like pop up on your, the bottom left of your screen saying like, watch this clip and you'll get what they call orbs. That's a complete side conversation. But the point being, they have the ability to push information, which means they have the ability to push safety information and well-being information if they so chose. And so I hope that's something that we can see more of with platforms. But I also think with boys and masculinity in particular, that's relevant because it's not just enough to like build in safety tools because of what we already talked about in terms of like the norms and expectations for what it means to be a boy or to be a man means you're nonchalant, and you're indifferent and you're not going to reach out and ask for help if you're struggling or facing something unsafe, or you might not even recognize that your own boundaries have been crossed until you start feeling uncomfortable. And so, for example, in the aftermath of the pandemic, my colleagues and I did some research with boys. It was a relatively small sample size, but it was really interesting that we started to uncover this disconnect between what boys said they believed, what boys believed and what they actually experienced. So, for example, we had like more than 9 in 10 boys said it's okay to ask for help, right? So like more than 90% of boys are like, asking for help is good and it's okay, and you should ask for help if you're struggling. We had like, I think 70% of boys said, I have struggled, I felt overwhelmed, stressed, or not like myself in the last week or the last month or whatever it was. But then it was something like less than 30% of them actually said, I have asked for help. So all of a sudden there's this gap between those. It's like 90% of boys said that it's okay to ask for help, but only 30% of them actually had done so. And I think that's similar with other like elements of safety online is that like we at the same time of developing those tools or those practices or policies, like we need to be working to disrupt the cultural expectations that boys don't ask for help or they don't recognize their own boundaries. And in order for them to feel more comfortable reaching out.
The research that you were doing about boys perception versus what they actually live and experience was very interesting. Do boys tend to feel comfortable to ask how for certain things in your experience? Like I can ask help for this, but these are the topics that are usually off table or off topic or things that I don't want to address.
That's an interesting question. I think this goes back to like the relational pedagogy thing,
Yeah.
which is the content matters a lot less than the relationship. So I don't think it's so much that some topics are okay and some topics aren't, but some people are okay and some
Okay.
people aren't. And, like I could think of a boy who's asked me everything from like how to restring his guitar to like how to ask out a girl that he likes. So they're like, and that's about relationship rather than like this is okay versus that. But I think when I'm thinking about like topics and help seeking and that kind of thing, well, I'll tell one more story. This is actually a story of myself. I was at my brother's birthday party. It was his birthday's in March, and I bicycled to his house, and then there was a giant snowstorm. In fact, there was a snowstorm and a thunderstorm at the same time.
Oh,
And
wow.
someone offered me a ride home, and I said, no, it's fine. And they pointed out to me, Jonathan, how would you feel if you could drive somebody home? Like you had the opportunity to drive somebody home. I was like, I would feel responsible, trusted, resourceful, capable, like all of these good things. And so we ended up talking in this conversation about like, what does it look like to actually flip the script and think less of asking something of someone else and more so offering them the opportunity to feel all of those good things as a trusted resource in your life. And the difference there is as a boy or as a young man, I go from feeling like a deficiency. I'm not strong enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm like too intimidated by this snowstorm or I'm too overwhelmed by this online experience. There's all this deficit kind of pieces to it. To actually there's a strengths-based piece there that's like I'm offering something of another person, which is their opportunity to feel a better human being, I guess.
I love that. I love that so much. The reciprocal nature. We've been conditioned not to see the gifts that other people offer. Like we usually look at things as kind of a one-way exchange. Like,
Mm,
and I love that you're flipping the script and offering that, creating that full circle moment for us. So thank
yeah.
you.
And you're bringing me back to one of the resources that I printed early on in the days that we started working with you, Jonathan, which was a list of vocabulary words to describe attributes, adjectives to describe oneself. And what we ended up doing was printing them and laminating them and putting them all around the school. So
Yeah.
students would walk by kind of innocuous and here's this word there, but it's fine tuning vocabulary around things like I'm not just smarter. It's not just about being smart. It's about being inquisitive. It's about being a
Mm,
problem solver. It's about being a critical thinker. The more that we kind of drip those words with which they can describe themselves, I think the more we move them away from a really narrow definition of what it means to be a man or to be good enough also, right? And I think that story, that's really what that brought up for me was the subtle ways in which you're not only modeling for them, but also giving them a broader vocabulary to describe themselves too.
Mhm.
So those relationships are essential. And I think really also what would be vital for our conversation today is to think about how not only boys, but how youth are engaging in relationships and how different and complex that looks. So I'd love for us to spend some time talking about consent and healthy relationships and how that sort of molds into the work that Next Gen Men does as well. So, in particular, there's a study that I want to point to that I think sort of highlights some of the gaps and the need for the work that the critical work that I know that you do, Jonathan. So, it was done by Western, Dalhousie, and Concordia, and it took a systems level approach to reviewing the resources in Canadian secondary schools around technologically facilitated sexual violence. It assessed how secondary schools address it within their curriculum and within their policies. And what the study revealed is that there's a significant gap in the way that gender based harms, power imbalances, and intersectionalities are taught in schools. And the trend is to mostly focus on physical relationships and overlook the digital ones. So this sort of circles back to the point about the extra support that's needed to facilitate these conversations and how vital that is. And so my question is, how do you see the way in which young people are engaging in relationships, being intimate image sharing, being conversations in digital spaces exclusively? How does that fold into your work, Jonathan?
Yeah, well, first off, I think to be blunt, like any conversation about relationships or even like well-being, like that doesn't acknowledge the digital element of young people's lives is like at this point is an outdated conversation. It's really inadequate to be talking about the nuance of like let's just say like bystander intervention or yeah or stereotypes or or conflict resolution without talking about how those things show up online. A way that I often explain it is, when I was young, we had the digital space. I'm young enough that like social media was super relevant when I was in high school, but there was a bifurcation in that, or like a separation in that, like we would talk online to make plans to meet in person, or we would take pictures in person in order to post them online. But there was a bit of a separation or a distinction there, whereas now those spaces are like, I mean, any educator who's like experienced 6, 7 in the classroom knows that they're constantly intertwined with each other. And you really can't talk about something like healthy relationships or consent without exploring how that, how that is different and or the same in online communication. And there's a lot that we could talk about. Like there's a whole separate podcast episode in a way. But one thing that I would also like to highlight is essentially the ways that the stereotypes and expectations of masculinity are weaponized against boys in online spaces in ways that are often under-recognized by the people who should be looking out for their well-being. So essentially what I'm saying is not that like boys are more vulnerable or more victimized and therefore a higher priority, but just that they're often under-recognized and because of these like specific contexts. So and pressures and expectations. So just for example, when we think of what's called sextortion, where you get someone's sexualized image and then you blackmail them with it, that impacts all young people. But for boys, financial sextortion, boys ages 13 to 17 are between 92 to like 97% of the victims of financial sextortion, which is blackmailing this young person and saying, you need to give me money or I'm going to leak this to your entire school, or whatever it might be. Like let's just say 95% of victims are boys ages 13 to 17. In terms of like, yeah, relationships, consent, and like online experiences, boys are more likely to sext to begin with, more likely to sext with somebody they don't know, more likely to sext with somebody whose age they don't know or who's older than them, more likely to have their image then used against them, and I could keep going on. That there's this heightened element of vulnerability because of how boys are navigating that specific online space. And we see the same thing, different, but the same kind of trend pop up with AI generated new deep fakes, with gambling and crypto and sports betting. There's these different sort of spaces online, some of which are related to consent, some of which aren't, but that are all kind of at this overlap of what's expected of boys, which is, for example, to be able to get girls, and to not ask for help. And all of a sudden that boy is a lot more vulnerable than he would have been otherwise. Like, it's hard to say this to a pair of mothers of young boys, but like there's been headlines of quite young teenage boys who've taken their lives experiencing something like financial sextortion. And I've really found myself just thinking about how simple the conversation could have been in that classroom, that health curriculum, to just say, like, I pray to God for you students that this doesn't happen to you. But like if something like that does, you're not alone. And there's somebody in your life, like, let it be me who will help who'll navigate that with you. And you don't need to be ashamed, and we're going to figure it out together, because there are resources and ways to handle and respond to those situations. But boys who haven't been told that that might happen, back to that like sidewalk metaphor of like looking for those stop signs and that kind of thing, they feel like everything of the shame and the fear and the panic and navigate that entirely alone. So again, there's lots that we could say about consent and healthy relationships, and like we haven't even touched on like porn literacy, and like there's a lot there, but those are two pieces that are often top of mind for me.
I think the stakes are immensely high for boys in engaging in online spaces and in their perception of relationships, especially as it pertains to sexual curiosity, right? And as a consent educator, I will boldly say that I think the curriculum is nowhere near where it needs
Uh-huh.
to be, and that social media and pornography are filling the gaps. The average age of porn exposure for youth is between 8 and 11, with boys being on the lower end of that spectrum. Uh, and they say that by age 16, about 70% of boys have watched porn 4 to 5 times per week. If they're not being given that safe space to unpack the extreme things that they're being exposed to online, or that they're then seeking out after that exposure, where is the education, where's the safety, where's the intervention, how are we responding to those statistics?
Totally. And this goes back to that piece about this is about boys' well-being. I've had boys talk about struggling with porn addiction and feeling a lot of guilt and shame and confusion about that. And like listeners probably know, but like porn in a lot of ways normalizes aggression and violence, especially towards girls and women. And it's like the majority of boys who watch porn are under the impression that it's a realistic representation of sexual experiences. So yeah, this is about
Because
their
nowhere is
well-being.
there a message telling them
Yeah,
otherwise, right?
exactly.
Nowhere is there a narrative or a space to counter. Sorry to jump in, but just
No.
reiterating what you're saying. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it
My,
probably goes
like sorry, go ahead,
sorry.
Stephanie.
No, and it probably goes back to that point that you said earlier about that young boy not feeling enough. If I don't watch pornography and know what I'm doing,
Mhm.
then I'm not going to be enough. And I don't have, and even as you were talking about relationships, maybe I don't have a safe person that I can talk about this with honestly. So porn is going to be my educator in this particular space. And so I think, as you're talking about the curriculum and how powerful would it be to have, a little bit more developed and, where teachers or educators or whatever sphere you're in are using those powerful phrases like, I'm here,
Mm.
I'm here to walk with you, let's explore this, let them understand, the beauty of what a sexual relationship is and how pornography can distort that. I think those conversations need to be had in a more in a collective way. I'm not saying some educators are not doing it or that there aren't workshops or things that are happening, but I think, given the fact that Christy was talking about how pervasive pornography is and how in your own experience, Jonathan, that you see this come up and up again,
Mhm.
it really is quite alarming and it really does demand our focused attention, I
Yeah.
believe.
There was a study in 2023 for parents who might be questioning the pervasiveness of this. This to me was pretty mind-blowing in terms of the volume. That Pornhub totaled 28,000 people visiting the website every second, which was more than Instagram, Netflix, Pinterest, and TikTok combined. I mean, of course, there are adults factored into that, but when we think about the scale, like bigger than Netflix, bigger than TikTok combined, the pervasiveness of that, of course, young people are lumped into that audience.
Yeah. And we're all afraid to talk about it. One of my metaphors, I think I read this in someone's Substack years and years ago, but essentially, like the comparison is like, I think I mentioned this at the start, but like it's like a car chase that like you could, as a teenage boy, you could watch like an actual Fast and Furious movie late at night and then come down the next day and be like, okay, so I watched this like crazy car chase. That's not actually how driving really works, is it? And you could just talk about that. It'd be pretty normal. But you couldn't be like, I watched hardcore porn that I was not ready to see. What am I supposed to make of that? Like, there isn't really an avenue to talk that through. And yeah, I want to give one other example though, because maybe there's parents or educators that are like, yeah, I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole. Uh, I think that like everybody from the Sex and Information Education Council of Canada would say young people are looking for more realistic conversations and they would like to talk about this kind of thing. But if you're like, yeah, porn is not my thing, just like as another example, gambling is another significant rise in crisis, especially in online spaces and especially with boys. And if anybody here listening has like seen a sports game, you can't watch a sports game these days without seeing BetRivers, FanDuel, Bet365 and every other sports betting platform. And it's targeting boys specifically because these platforms know if they can teach boys or demonstrate to boys it's fun, you'll make money and your friends are doing it or the influencers, celebrities that you follow are doing it, they're more likely to gamble more often and more likely to lose money when they do. That's all research from Common Sense Media. But just as an example, I had a boy in a session, he was a grade 9, ask me, what's the difference between investing and gambling? And I was like,
Mm.
that's actually a really interesting question. And what I want to demonstrate with this story is that I didn't climb up on a soapbox and say, here's what you need to know about, like, about not falling victim to the gambling platform. I really was like, I actually don't have the answers for you guys. This is new and it's emerging, but I'm going to explore it with you and let's talk it through together. And so we made a continuum of the lowest risk versus the highest risk ways to use money to make money. So everything from government bonds to crypto and sports betting parlays. And they had the opportunity to explore for themselves, to educate me on a couple of things. But I also had the opportunity to let them know some of what we know, that, for example, most day traders, the vast majority of day traders, lose money. And parlays are they're promoted the most often by sports betting platforms because they're the most profitable product for that sports betting platform, period. And the point being, though, that in exploring that continuum, they had the opportunity to learn way more and develop more resilience to those messages than they otherwise would. So whether it's body image, masculinity influencers, whether it's porn or gambling or some other element of what's going on kind of behind the scenes in boys' lives, we're back to this idea of like curiosity, really understanding and trying to like find out more about where they're at and then have that conversation in a collaborative way. And yeah, and I think honestly, those are the conversations that are going to help boys stay safer, whether it's sexuality, relationships, consent, finances, or anything else.
I also think there's an entry point to echo what you're saying, Jonathan, with the curiosity piece, in that helping them to understand how these things work, right? Because boys love to understand that too. I think that's a really
Yeah,
sort of critical question
totally.
that that young man asked. Understanding the ways in which the online manosphere universities, for example, or some of the structures of these betting apps are exploitive, right? How are they exploiting you, and how are they taking advantage of you, and giving them that understanding of how they work, so then they can decide whether or not, like, if this is set up for me to lose rather than gain, it becomes more of, there's more autonomy in the choice rather than I won't be on there because I was told I shouldn't and it's bad.
Yeah, I love that.
So, Jonathan, there was a statement on your LinkedIn profile that really resonated with the both of us. And it reads, everyone wants to talk about boys. Barely anyone is talking with boys. Can you say a little bit more about this and why conversations with boys are so important in light of all that we've spoken about today?
Yeah. That's relevant in basically any possible context. But something that I was talking about recently is this Canada online harms legislation, is that like the actual expectations for platforms haven't been identified. And what are the guiding principles of the emerging independent regulatory body? All of that is kind of still up in the air. So I was like, let me on LinkedIn to give you my 2 cents, as one does. But I mapped it to the model that we use for our online programming, which is called Systems of Care. Systems of Care is built on the Circle of Courage framework, which comes from Lakota Nation, about how young people flourish. And I promise this comes back to like relevance with the question, but essentially that our system of safety is built on the spirit of independence, that young people can't be independent, feel independent unless they feel safe. Our system of engagement is based on the spirit of mastery. Our system of connection is based on the spirit of belonging. And our system of empowerment is based on the spirit of generosity. So the idea is that young people, but especially young men, are looking for independence, mastery, belonging, and generosity. And so with this generosity piece, they want to be empowered to give back to the world. And so in my advice to the emergent independent regulator in Canada, basically safety has to mean communication and not surveillance. Engagement has to mean a community that's so meaningful to a young person that they come back to it, rather than an algorithm that's so addictive for a young person that they can't put it down. Belonging has to mean not just mitigating harm, but also promoting pro-social behavior. And then really importantly, and in response to your question about talking with boys, empowerment has to mean that young people's voices are included at the table. That essentially, whether it's social media legislation or consent, workshops, or how did you treat your brother today, young people's voices are the catalyst for transformation to take place. If they're not actually being adequately and meaningfully included in the conversation is just washing right over them. And I had the opportunity to bring a couple of boys to a gathering that was organized by Public Safety Canada. And one of the boys on stage, as part of a panel, was asked about something related to the social media ban. And he essentially, to this 50-year-old bureaucrat, was like, in his very sort of funny, but also kind of blunt, 15-year-old way, respectfully, you don't actually know what you're talking about. He was like, what social media? tell me what social media. And all the adults' heads exploded. And it was pretty funny. But he was also making the point that young people are the champions. They are the leaders. They are the ones who actually know what's going on in their lives. And so creating solutions for them or, delivering lectures to them actually completely misses the point and also misses the opportunity for ourselves as adults and also our families and our classrooms and our society to grow and change in important ways because of what critical insight and meaningful input they also have to share.
What a beautiful explanation and exploration of important things that we should take away today. It also reminds me a little bit of Boramate's book when he was talking about
Hmm.
cultural transmission. And he says that we're in a generation now where we're in the, if you're born in the 80s or 90s and beyond, and especially more so now with social media, that cultural transmission doesn't happen from adult to kid nowadays. It's often happening, or merging between peers. And so sometimes if we're talking about depending on which adults and which age groups, they think they might know because that's how culture was passed on to them. That's how life
Mm,
was passed on to them. And now we have a group of peers who are creating their own culture, their own groups. And so yeah, certainly they are the experts in their own world because this is the new world that's emerged. And I think
interesting.
about asking them is so relevant, and it's the only way we're going to move forward.
Such an important reflection, Stephanie. And I think, for us to just sort of wrap up, I love the framework that you shared, Jonathan. I think it's full circle, like you said, from where we started. The current landscape of masculinity needs us as the adults, as the mentors in their lives to carve out these safe spaces for conversation so curiosity can thrive. And we can kind of disrupt this narrative that seems to have everyone in a state of panic, right? I think that really is your starting line. So I want to thank you so much for your time, your wisdom, and your energy today, Jonathan. We will link resources to Jonathan's work and to Next Gen Men in the show notes. And as always, we are so grateful to have your energy and attention. And thanks for conferencing with us.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank